welcome back for Chapter 8. At sundown, Saturday, October 30th, residents throughout Wendell began to take precautions against the night's anticipated mischief, turning on all available porch and deck lights, parking the nicer of the family cars in the garage, leaving the dog out in the backyard a little bit later. In years past, such precautions weren't really necessary. The worst anyone suffered were a couple of soaped windshields, a few clumsily thrown eggs splattered on the front walk. And honestly, who didn't secretly chuckle at the sight of an old crabapple tree festooned with gently blowing streamers of toilet paper? But this year was different. It was more than just the rash of vandalism that had claimed church steeples throughout the country, more than the mysterious vanishings, more than the strange animal cries heard in the woods at night. There was something palpably different in the air, a premature chill. True, the King Frost Parade was so named for a reason, and any day now, local gardeners expected to wake and find that the first hard frost had crept in during the night and slaughtered the impatiens in their beds. But this early chill felt different, however, somehow, than other years, more wicked in some indefinable way. And so this mischief night, as the first bats began flitting among the treetops, parents began breaking the bad news to their children that they wouldn't be allowed out this year to rove the neighborhoods in giggling packs. It wasn't a decision reached like so many others after supermarket consultations with neighboring couples, but rather a silent town-wide consensus. Something was out there, the parents of Wendell knew, fastening the front door's deadbolt at 7:30, though they couldn't exactly say what was out there, and there were too many generations removed from superstition to call it by its given name, the curse. On the Danfield College campus, however, it was another story entirely. The parents of these 3,100 students were far, far away. While the need for a midterm bacchanalia was far more immediate, like the collegiate rule that dictates weekends shall begin on Thursday evening, Halloween was declared by the students of Danfield a two-night holiday, and as the first long shadows began to overreach the campus, the telltale signs of early celebration could be heard. Here, a peal of surprised laughter as a girl was hoisted onto a shoulder, there, the somber chords of some classic rock anthem blaring from a dorm window. In town, Sheriff Bill Nottingham was deep into the paperwork that rose up on all sides of him, like water in a flooded basement. 20 minutes earlier he'd grunted when his secretary, Agnes, had bid him good night, and now he looked up and saw with surprise that night had crept up on him. He was alone in the oasis of light cast by his single desk lamp. Outside the windows, which fronted the town square and the war memorial, darkness had gathered like an unexpected storm. He sipped his coffee and was surprised to find it cold. In the next room, the police scanner chattered quietly, his deputies, Jeff Schaefer and Reed Davis, reaching out to each other across the airwaves as they kept their lonely beat. All quiet, the sheriff thought, and made a mental note to himself of the time, 7:58. He hoped the town had seen the last excitement for the season. They'd earned it. Hell, with the last month's trouble, they should have earned themselves good karma into the next century. But he'd be satisfied with one quiet night. Just one. He would be disappointed. Wendy glanced out her window with a sense of apprehension, afraid her vicious genie was waiting out there in the night. Her parents had left for their fundraiser. She grabbed her duffel bag and headed downstairs where Alex waited. "Are we going where I think we're going?" Alex asked. "Same place," Wendy said. "It's usually secluded." "Right," he chagrined. He said, chagrined. "Usually. So what's in the bag?" "A few things I think I'll need," she said. On the drive to Gable Road, Alex was unnaturally silent. He fussed with his sunglasses, turning them over and over in his lap. Earlier he had seemed ready to sit in his first magic circle, but she suspected that might have been pure bravado. When they passed the Wendell Motel and Restaurant, he sat up a little straighter. "Having second thoughts?" she asked. "What if he says yes? Can I afford to let him back out now?" "No, I'm cool," he said, sounding nervous nonetheless. "You really think this ritual will help you?" "It has to." "I do. Wendy said, trying to sound calm. Maybe it's just for my peace of mind, she said, offering him a rational bone to chew on. It was one thing to accept her eccentricities as part of her personality, but quite another for him to participate in them willingly. Maybe my dreams and insomnia and psychosomatic. Maybe my dreams and insomnia are psychosomatic, and this is the placebo I need to get me back on track. Who knows, Alex said, and she was grateful he hadn't jumped on the easy, rational conclusion she had offered. If you feel you need to do this, then you probably do. She braked suddenly and swerved onto the shoulder. Alex's hand clutched the dashboard. We're here, she said. You asked me earlier about my self-control. What exactly? I'll tell you what to do once we're in the clearing, Wendy said. We have to get off the road before somebody sees us and decides to help. She stepped out of the car, taking the duffel bag with her. After she tied the soiled T-shirt to her door handle, she pushed in the lock knob and slammed the door shut. She started for the woods, then noticed Alex was still in the car. Returning to the car, she leaned toward his open window and said, Alex? Just trying to steel myself, get my head in the game, he said, then sighed and climbed out the car. He tossed his sunglasses on the dashboard, then slammed his door after a reluctant shrug. She kissed him lightly and said, No altars, I promise. I know, he said. I trust you. He followed her along the deer trail to her special clearing in the woods. Don't worry, she said. We're all alone. Famous last words. Well, she thought, you should know. Alex watched patiently as she dug a circular groove in the dirt, filled it with flour through a paper funnel to form a white circle, then marked the 4 points of the compass with burning candles in antique brass holders. He sat down outside the circle as she placed a bowl of rice to the north, a cup of wine to the west, a brass burner ablaze with kindling to the south, and finally the brass incense holder with 3 sandalwood sticks smoking to the east. She removed the contents of the wooden chest, laid the mandrake root atop it, then unfolded her meditation mat. She stood in the center of the circle, her face set in an expression of grim concentration. Alex looked around the deep blackness of the woods, the red and orange and yellow of leaves that still clung tenaciously to gnarled branches, the tree trunks stark silhouettes, strangely two-dimensional in the cold light of the moon. His gaze always returned to the center of the glade, glowingly alive within the 4 points of fire, sparks of flame glinting in her eyes. Wendy seemed the only thing of substance in this gray and black landscape. She picked up her linen robe and stepped out of the circle, stepping carefully over the white line to join Alex. Everything's ready now, she said, draping the robe over her shoulders. I used a smaller circle to concentrate the heat from the candles and the burner. That should keep us warm. She took a breath, then asked, Are you ready to join me? Maybe it would help if you explained again why this is necessary, he suggested. To stop the nightmares, to cure my insomnia, she said patiently. And I feel like my life is coming apart at the seams. Something like this worked before, but I need your help to make it stronger. Will I have nightmares about this? He said with a nervous smile. Calm thoughts, she said. Pleasant dreams. You'll be fine. Her smile was inviting, somehow comforting. I'd like you to join me. I'm comfortable with you. I trust you. But if this makes you uncomfortable, it defeats the purpose of having you within the circle. It has to be your willing decision. Her confidence was a little false bravado for his sake. She was nearly ready to collapse from nerves. But the ritual was important. Though she wavered, she always returned to this certainty. She reached within her robe, began unbuttoning her V-neck sweater. And the nudity thing is important? To be in tune with nature, she said. Clothes dampen the natural power of your body. I thought that was a line only guys used, he said, smiling. He was blushing faintly, walking in tight circles with his hands on his hips, as if cooling down from a hard run. He kept stealing furtive glances in her direction. Okay, all right. She smiled, slipped her arms out of her sweater under the robe like a contortionist working free of a straitjacket, but her hands trembled nervously. She told herself, It's okay. This is just like that time I went skinny dipping with Scott James in Cooper Pond. I have nothing to be ashamed of. It's natural. Completely natural. A French woman wouldn't even give this a second thought. And I really do trust Alex. It's okay. She breathed deeply, and that helped to steady her hands. She kicked off her cross trainers, doffed her black jeans. She forced herself not to hesitate when she got down to her underwear. She hooked her thumbs in her panties and then skinned them down. See how easy that was? She thought. Just don't think about it too much. God, is he looking? She had been able to remove the bandage from her thigh. The wounds she'd dug with her own nails had almost completely healed. 4 faint pink lines were the only traces of the injury. She doubted she would even have scars. Just another part of the strangeness that is my life. She folded her clothes neatly atop the duffel bag, then finally looked at Alex. I'm going to begin now, she said evenly. You can join me up till the moment I close the circle by facing east, the incense burner, the second time. If you join me, I will guide you through the ritual. Leave your clothes here with mine and be careful not to break the circle when you enter it. Without waiting for his answer, she turned her back to him to step into the circle again. She stood on her meditation mat, trying to calm herself and fight her own rising embarrassment. She was aware of his gaze fixed on her back. Maybe he thought she was out for revenge for his spying on her, to get him stripped down to his birthday suit. It was too late to ease that possible concern. He would just have to trust her. With some degree of grace, she loosened the drawstring of the robe and let it slide down her body. It fell with an urgent whisper of cloth against skin. She heard a sharp intake of breath as she turned to face Alex, who stood just within reach of the candlelight. He was looking fixedly in her eyes, and she was surprised to see a confidence there in his expression, too, a startling trust. The fallen robe formed a warm ring of cloth around her as she sat in the lotus position, facing east. The night was colder than last time, but the flames were closer. She shivered in the cool breeze, welcomed each hint of warmth from the fire. She placed her herbs, flowers, mortar, pestle, and stones within reach, then closed her eyes and concentrated on centering herself. She must draw energy from the earth and the sky, from herself and her interaction with Alex, should he decide to participate, and hold all those energies within herself until it was time to channel them. She fought to eliminate all outside awareness, trying to remove Alex from her consciousness. When she opened her eyes, he might be gone, or he might even stay, but not join her in the circle. The smallest possibility, the one she most desperately hoped for, remained. But as she had told him, this was his decision, beyond her control, outside her center. When at last she felt completely focused, at peace, her eyes fluttered open, as if she awoke from a hypnotist's trance. Now she must commune with the elements. Welcome, my mind, to your essence, air, she said, her voice trembling, her gaze climbing the fairy rope of incense smoke into the night sky. She shifted her position. Welcome, my heart, to your essence, fire. She was most conscious of fire, as she ached for the warmth it provided. Welcome, my life, to your essence, water, she said, sipping wine as she faced west. Shifted again. Welcome, my body, to your essence, earth, she said, aware of the firm ground beneath her. Next, she must turn to the east again, to close the circle. Still no Alex. As she lowered the cup, Alex stepped into the circle, naked, hurrying to sit down. Sorry, he said, quickly, either apologizing for waiting till the last minute, for his obvious physical arousal, or for his general embarrassment. She took his hand, her nostrils flaring with the inhalation of fire and smoke, burning wax and cold, hard earth. That's okay. You don't have to stand at attention, she said, glancing down briefly with a grin. He blushed furiously, then said, Don't just stare at my webbed feet. They both laughed together, the tension evaporating like gasoline, up and away, not quite gone, but not quite as bad either. Alex, I want you to close your eyes. Good. Now think of something peaceful, a meadow in springtime, or a sheltered cove. Think of your own breathing, your heartbeat, as the current in the stream, and flow with it. Be soothed by it. Take your time. Minutes passed. She withdrew her light torch, leaving him alone in the circle. I'm sorry, she withdrew her light touch, leaving him alone in the circle. Okay, she said. Open your eyes and look with me to the east, to the incense. I want you to picture yourself carried away with the smoke, floating upward into the sky, at peace. Take your time. Tell me when you feel it. She waited until he had nodded, then directed him to the south point and the incense burner. After he had looked to each of the 4 elements, turning again to east to closed the circle, she nodded and said, "Now we're ready." She ground chamomile flowers with the mortar and pestle, enough for both of them, then poured the powder into 2 ceramic cups and added fresh water. "Drink this," she said. "It prepares you for magic." After she drank her potion, he drank his, watching her over the lip of the cup. His lips pursed at the unfamiliar taste. After placing their empty cups on the ground, she picked up 2 necklaces with tiny linen sachets of anise fruits. She slipped one over her head, then held one up until he bowed his head, then slipped it down his neck. Likewise, she had prepared 2 necklaces with moonstones in muslin pouches. In hers, she had added an amethyst to draw dreams. She would prepare the actual valerian infusion and drink it later before she pursued her dreams. Everything had started with the dreams, and in the dreams she believed there was a resolution. But first she would need the insight of divination. She had powdered henbane in a small jar reserved for poisonous substances. Turning to the south, the element of fire, she gathered a pinch of henbane between her thumb and index finger. "Don't inhale this," she said. "Why?" "Poisonous." "Good answer." She held the pinch of henbane over the flames. "Henbane go where I cannot be. Henbane look where I cannot see." When the breeze momentarily died, she tossed the henbane into the fire. The flames crackled and danced. Wendy poured a small amount of fresh water over her hand, then dried it on her robe. "Now we begin for real," she said. All through the preliminary stages of the ceremony, she noticed that he was being careful not to look below the level of her chin. She almost loved him now, sincerely. She almost loved him for how sincerely he was participating, how hard he was trying. But now she needed him to look at her. Now they had to get close. "Look at me," she said. "I am looking at you." "Not just my eyes," she said, smiling. "The rest of me. All of me. It's okay to take a look at the goods. As long as I don't have to stand any time soon." "It's a natural response," she said. "That's the reason I needed you here. Tantric magic. Psychosexual energy will boost the magical energies we've allowed into ourselves." "You're the expert," he said. "What will you be doing while I look at you?" "That's easy," she said, trying to sound as if she actually done this part before. "I will look at you. And," she added, reaching out, "touch you." Karen had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep after returning from the ER following her seizure the previous night, slept throughout the long day, and clear on through the following nightfall. Paul kept a nervous vigil in a folding chair at her bedside, periodically refreshing the damp cloth on her brow. Briefly, at 8:30, Karen surfaced from the sleep and smiled, and gave his hand a squeeze. He held her hand and looked into her eyes, neither of them speaking, and before a single minute had passed on the bedside digital clock, her grip loosened and she sank back under. Eventually, Paul's own exhaustion got the better of him, and lulled by the sound of Karen's breathing, he dozed off beside her, still holding her limp hand in his own. A breeze hissed through the window screen and stirred the lace curtains, while somewhere very far away a dog barked its unheeded warning. This was the moment Art chose to slip away. He took Karen's bike, an old 10-speed with its ram's horn handlebars wrapped in fraying tape. It felt comfortable to be on a bike again, and it was true that you never forgot how to ride one, pedaling silently through the chilly dark. He felt invisible and vulnerable, and noted with satisfaction that he passed a night jogger and his tethered lab without either seeming to notice. He could smell winter on the horizon, crouching, impatient. The trees seemed to shiver in frightened anticipation of its arrival. The night was too dark, darker than it should be, given the full moon that hung fat and festering like a rotten gourd just above the rooftops. But he was grateful for the dark and the cover it would provide him once he reached his destination. 10 minutes later he was there, hiding the 10-speed in the pool of shadow behind the town's municipal building. He removed the flashlight from the backpack he'd brought up and ducked the alley. He found the low window, he remembered, behind a reeking dumpster. He wrapped his backpack around his wrist and punched out one glass pane, then reached inside and fumbled about until he felt the window latch. For once, he was grateful the Leeson family's rugged build had bypassed his genetic makeup as he wriggled his skinny hips through the narrow window frame and dropped down into the municipal building's basement. He switched on the flashlight quickly to banish the claustrophobic darkness. He was in one of the airless rooms town council used for their interminable monthly meetings. Spooky as shit down here, he thought, moving quickly in the direction of the stairwell. He ascended to the first floor. A corridor with doorways to either side, the offices of the mayor and the sheriff. Weak light spilled out through the glass door from the sheriff's. Someone was burning the midnight oil. Art slid along the wall, feet moving soundlessly over the buffed floor. Or at least, he hoped, he was moving without sound. He'd lost all objectivity, giving the timpani pounding of his own pulse in his ears. Finally, he reached the door of the Historical Society. Time now to separate the pros from the petty larcenists. He reached into his pocket and came up with a single key. His hand was shaking. Would they have changed the locks in 15 years? The key slid inside halfway and stuck. Art's heart stopped. He jiggled the key. Nothing. He retracted the key, rubbed his fingers on his forehead to pick up oil on the tips, then applied them to the key. This time it slid in with a quiet snick and turned. He slipped inside and reminded himself to breathe. In the dark, the only illumination came from Florence Reeder's screensaver, a broomsticked witch bouncing merrily off the boundaries of the computer monitor. And to think, 15 years ago, he'd considered that internship with the Historical Society a waste of time. 2 hours later, Art was knee-deep in data, searching town records in the last century for deviations from the national average mortality rate. He was working on instinct, chasing some elusive intersection of hunch and hypothesis that hovered just beyond his reach. Could Wendell's rise in infant mortality rates, birth defects, and unexplained illnesses be linked back to toxic waste from the textile mills? This was the question that he'd come here tonight to investigate, but just when he thought he'd isolated a single thread of mystery, the image of Karen's terrifying seizure the night before kept intruding itself. Why had Karen hallucinated that she was Rebecca Cole, one of the Wendells' infamous three witches? And why, for that matter, was an 8-year-old little girl hallucinating that she was Sarah Hutchins? Try as he might to filter out these digressions from his pure line of inquiry, Art couldn't help feeling the two were somehow involved, that the same psychological mechanism that was causing a town to turn an ecological disaster into a curse was also causing two of its citizens to turn its witch-hanging legacy into a living nightmare. Shit, but this was becoming complicated. He felt like a child who discovers too many pieces to a jigsaw puzzle. Tough shit, Professor, Art thought, reminding himself that in the real world mysteries didn't come packaged as concise little thesis statements. Figure it out. Go back to the data. He conducted another data sort, looking at death rates in various years over the latter part of the 19th century. Good old Floss should get a civic commendation for transferring a mountain of old manual records into the township's computer system. Given the mill fire that had claimed 38 lives, 1899, of course, was a banner year for Wendell's morticians. As Art revisited that tragedy now, though, he saw something in the column of luminescent numbers that he'd glossed over before. The date the fire had occurred, October 28th. He frowned, began typing in commands, told the database to sort the town's 1899 deaths by date. The cursor blinked at him as the PC worked, the hard drive humming quietly in concentration. 144 deaths that year, 78 of which clustered in the month of October. You didn't have to be an actuary to know that that was more than statistically significant. And you didn't have to be a physician to know that if these deaths were all attributable to toxic groundwater, they would have been more evenly distributed throughout the year, unless for some reason Wendell's citizens preferred to die around Halloween. He didn't trust the data and decided to repeat the sordid query, but when he typed in the command, he saw that his finger had slipped on the keys and he'd accidentally typed 1799. He was about to cancel the command when the data for the last year in the 18th century began scrolling down the screen, and saw the same pattern the century before. Art sat very still, staring at the screen as his hypothesis crumbled around him. The year 1799 was a full 50 years before the first textile mill opened in Wendell, and while Wendell had been a significantly smaller hamlet in 1799, a disproportionate number of its residents had died in the month of October. October 1799. October 1899. You didn't have to be an actuary to see that this was also statistically significant, and you didn't have to be superstitious to suddenly start believing in curses. He logged out of the database, began gathering his notes and shoving them into his backpack. Time to get the hell out of here. As he retreated through the dark, he collided with something hard and heard the crunch of glass, a display case. Overhead, an alarm began ringing. At the sound of the alarm, the sheriff opened his desk drawer and removed his service automatic. He bolted out of his office and scanned the dark corridor, looking for immediate and obvious signs of the break-in. The plate glass front doors were intact. Must be one of the back doors. He started running in that direction, hoping he wasn't charging into a situation, without backup no less, that he'd later regret. He stopped abruptly as he passed the Historical Society's office. Something different about the place, though he couldn't specify exactly what. Something out of place. The computer monitor. It glowed faintly, the only light in the place after hours. Nothing unusual there. Florence always left her computer on, so she could access it from home. Then the sheriff suddenly realized what was bothering him. Where was the screensaver? The monitor glowed at the login screen. Someone had been using it recently. The sheriff fumbled for his keys, unlocked the door, and slipped inside, his gun arm rigid at his right thigh. He scanned the Historical Society's single large room. No furniture besides Florence's desk, so there was no place to hide. Except the Witch Museum. He could see the first two mannequins, dressed as colonials, just inside the museum's entrance. The sheriff chambered around and entered the dark museum. Seen from above, the floor plan of the Witch Museum resembled, appropriately enough, the ideographic symbol for female, so that visitors eventually were forced to exit via the same short hallway they'd first entered. Within the loop was a mini-theater where an old PBS documentary on the Salem witch hysteria played continuously on a well-mounted television, and it was in here that Art was hiding when he heard the sheriff call out, "This is the police. There's only one way out of here, and I'm standing in it with a gun. You understand?" Art didn't answer. He slid along the round carpeted wall, hoping the sheriff wouldn't try to be heroic and come after him. Suddenly, the television in the mini-theater winked to life. Art heard an electrical breaker being thrown and saw a row of theatrical lights just outside the mini-theater brighten, throwing violet spotlights on a chamber of horrors-style black mass. On the TV, the documentary narrator said, "While the Salem hysteria looms large in the American collective conscious, the episode merits barely a footnote in the greater European tragedy of 17th century witch purges." Art slipped out of the mini-theater, clinging to the shadows. He scanned this part of the museum, looking for a fire exit, a window, anything. But the walls here were smooth, the windows plastered over and painted. In this so-called Age of Enlightenment, one province of Alsace alone saw the public burning of more than 5,000. Like a stage backdrop to create an illusion of sky, Art found himself before the big showstopper of the tour, 3 mannequins standing on a papier-mâché gallows, while a fourth, the Puritan hangman, perhaps a distant ancestor of the sheriff's, stood frozen in the act of lowering a noose around the neck of the youngest witch. The witches were portrayed here sympathetically, 3 young women sent to an ugly and untimely death by a paranoid mob. Art hesitated for a moment, face to face with the coven's supposed ringleader, Elizabeth Wither. She stared at Art with painted, lifeless eyes. And though few today believe these women were responsible for the supernatural crimes for which they were hanged, many historians agree that at least some were in fact practicing witches, devotees of a domestic religious cult that predated Christendom. "Freeze!" Art heard behind him, and when he began to turn, "Don't fucking move! Show me your hands!" Art did as he was told. He felt the barrel of the sheriff's gun press against the back of his head. "Put your hands there," the sheriff said, and Art placed both hands in front of him on the papier-mâché gallows. The rickety structure shifted beneath Art's weight, threatening to tip. The sheriff kicked Art's legs apart and into a spread eagle stance. Art heard the rattle of handcuffs being removed from the sheriff's belt. Art gripped the gallows in both hands and gave a sharp, sudden tug. The whole display toppled forward, crashing down on top of them. The crosspiece hit the sheriff in the face with a soft whoomp, knocking him backward. Art rolled free and came up in a crouch. He saw the sheriff's gun on the floor and kicked it away into the shadows. Then he began running. Wendy was conscious that her breathing had quickened. She was nervous, but hoped Alex was too distracted to notice. "This is just like heavy petting," she told herself. And you have tried that a time or two before, kiddo." She nodded slightly to herself. "Okay, just like heavy petting. Very bizarre heavy petting. You can handle it, no pun intended. One step at a time. Center yourself. Hope he doesn't think you're a nutcase. Center. Here goes." Wendy reached out her hand and closed her fingers gingerly around Alex's scrotum. He gulped convulsively. "Let me guess," he said. "This is where the self-control comes into play?" She nodded, smiling. "We have to build each other's arousal level. As the psychosexual energy increases, so, too, does the magical energy. Both energies travel along the same pathways in the body. You have to touch me, too, but don't break eye contact or we'll have to start all over again. Maintaining eye contact is very important." "Well, what happens at the peak?" "I'll prepare an infusion of valerian to drink before I go to sleep." "That's not what I meant," Alex said. "I mean between us. Do we ever—" "Oh, no," she said. He couldn't hide his disappointment. "That would dissipate the magical energy too soon." "Oh, I just thought—" he began. "You know, seal it with a kiss." "Not while we're in the circle," she said. "We won't always be in the circle," Alex said. "Good answer," she said with a smile. "Okay," Alex said. "Maintain eye contact. I think I can remember that. Self-control and eye contact. No problem." "Good," she said, her hands moving lightly over him. "So what happens if I lose my self-control?" "You can't," she said quickly. "That would dissipate the magic." "Not to mention other things," Alex said, then cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably on the ground. "I'll try to keep that in mind." "Let me know if you feel yourself losing control," she said. "I'll slow down until you're ready." "Thanks," Alex said. "Just relax yourself," Wendy said, "and touch me." "Touch you? I need to build my tantric energy too." "I'm sure you do," he said, inhaling sharply as he felt Wendy's fingers stir where they held him. The flecks of gold in his brown eyes seemed to grow larger as Wendy fought her own instincts and maintained eye contact. She was aware of his right hand moving, his fingers lighting on her breast, finding her nipple. A chill raced up her spine, arcing her back, pushing her breasts slightly against her hands. Now she knew what he meant by a long night. "I'll let you know if I'm about to lose control," she said. "That's only fair," he said. At one point, as Wendy's menstruations became fevered with her own arousal, At one point, as Wendy's ministrations became fevered with her own arousal, Alex said, "Slow!" and she stopped stroking him. Her hands drifted up his muscular abdomen, across the broad plane of his runner's chest, out to his shoulders and upper arms, then back in again. His hands slid down the inward curve of her waist, then out with the swell of her hips, along the curve of her outer thighs, rounding her knees and in, along her inner thighs, meeting at the center, where the soft curls of hair hid a surprising warmth. After a few moments, he said, "I think I'm okay now." "Good," she said, and began to gently increase the motion of her hand on him. Her other hand fell to her side, where the small linen pouch of valerian root waited. In moments, she might begin to lose control. She fumbled with the lip of the bottle she'd brought for the valerian infusion, poured the ground root down the long neck, spilling some on the ground. She was breathing hard, trying to set her hands to separate tasks, separate rhythms. She clumsily grabbed the bottle of fresh water she'd brought and sloshed it into the spell bottle. The mixture would be the most potent she had ever prepared. She stoppered to the bottle, shook it briefly, then dropped it on its side as Alex's hand moved against her, fingers inside of her. She gripped his shoulder with her free hand now. She felt the brittle tensions that had been moving slowly up through her abdomen, balanced as carefully as a house of cards, begin to tremor. She heard rapid breathing, was confused for several instants whether it was hers or Alex's, and behind it all she was desperately alert to any change, a filament of the supernatural, woven deep down at the core, beneath all this sensation, and some sign the tantric magic was working. Was that it? She lost it. There? A ripple, beginnings of the end. We're almost finished, she said. That's what I'm afraid of, Alex whispered harshly. One more spell, she said, fumbling out her tektite stone and a piece of stiff sketch paper, twice folded. She worked it open with her free hand, momentarily dropping the stone to the ground. The sketch paper held the frightening image of her dark demon genie, the creature that had appeared to do her bidding, as misguided as it had been. Jen had given her one of the 100 sketches she had made, after Wendy had recovered from her shock at seeing so many faces, all the same, all hideous. What is that? Alex asked, taking his eyes momentarily from her. One of my nightmares, she said. A boogeyman. The branches high above them began to sway and clack together. Down in the clearing, a brisk breeze picked up, scattering dust and fallen leaves. The flames in the candles at the compass points guttered wildly. The fire in the burner leaned into the breeze, away from Wendy. With one hand occupied with Alex, Wendy hurriedly placed the stone in the center of the paper and refolded it. She held it over her burner as she repeated a banishing spell 3 times. Leave us forever, that all the ill may recover. With each repetition of the spell, the wind gusted more strongly, but the flames remained lit. She let the folded paper fall into the burner flame, and as the edges caught, she said to Alex, "Stop!" She removed her hand from his erection, but still felt his heat on her palm. As his hands reluctantly fell away from her body, flames erupted from the burner with a whooshing sound, reaching out a fiery, arcing tendril that caught her wrist and swirled up her arm, comforting her body in an instant of agony. Wendy screamed. Alex grabbed her shoulders and pulled her away from the burner. He tugged on her fallen robe in an attempt to throw the cloth over her burning arm, but as quickly as it had engulfed her arm, the unearthly flame vanished. What the hell was that? Wendy shook her head, weeping as he held her in his arms. Something magical had happened. She only hoped that the banishment had worked. Did you soak that paper in gasoline? He asked, staring at the burner in disbelief. Up until the moment the paper had been completely consumed, the flames were wildly agitated, bursting high, sparks crackling and jumping, almost seeming to reach out for something else to burn. Human flesh? When the paper was nothing but black ash, the flame winked out with a hiss. Wendy's arm appeared normal, but it ached, as if with a deep sunburn. She reached out with her other hand, gently touched Alex's face, which was coated with a fine sheen of sweat, and said, "We can break the circle now. Take me home." After Wendy had dismissed the elements, Alex dressed quickly, then helped her get dressed and pack up her magical equipment. She leaned against him all the way back to the car. Alex offered to drive, and Wendy simply nodded acquiescence. Neither spoke of the fire until they were in the car and had turned around on Gable Road. "I remember once when I was about 10, Alex said, playing with a Ouija board with my cousin Adrienne. I was skeptical about the whole thing, making jokes about it. Then that little plastic pointer thing started moving around the board, darting all by itself. Scared the hell out of me." "Is that what this was like?" Wendy asked, smiling faintly as she tried to picture Alex as a 10-year-old. "Worse," he said, taking his eyes off the road to look at her for a moment. "Much fucking worse." She took his hand in hers and held it till they reached her house. Wendy held onto Alex's upper arm as she pushed open her bedroom door. She was feeling better, but every now and then her legs went wobbly on her. "Thanks," she said. "I don't think I could have made it up our ever-so-grand staircase without your help." "You're sure you'll be okay up here alone?" Alex asked, concerned. "When are your parents due back from their fundraiser?" "Not for an hour or 2, Wendy said. "I'll be fine, but would you mind bringing up my magic stuff? I need that spell bottle. I'm afraid to sleep without taking that valerian potion I made." "I'd be afraid to sleep with it," Alex said, then shrugged. "Back in a flash." Wendy kicked off her cross trainers, stripped off her sweater and slacks, then her underwear and socks. She put the pile of clothes in her seldom used hamper and removed her flannel robe from its closet peg. She wrapped herself snugly in the soft cloth and lay down on her bed with a shudder, then a sigh. Good thing I had a witness, or I might believe I am losing my mind. Alex tapped lightly on her door, waited till she called him in. He set the duffel bag on the floor beside her bike, all except for the spell bottle, which he put on her nightstand. I guess that's everything, he said. Not everything, she said, motioning him over to the bed. He sat beside her. What did I forget? He asked. This, she said, and reached up to hold his face in her hands. She leaned up and kissed his mouth, his cheek, then whispered in his ear, Make love to me. He pulled back slightly. God, don't think I didn't come prepared, you know, hope springs eternal and all that, but are you sure you're up to this? Remember, she said, seal it with a kiss. She pulled him down into the circle of her arms, and if he was surprised at all by her strength, he didn't protest. His mouth fell to hers with a sudden passion as his hand slipped inside her robe to cup her breast. This is how she would always remember him, his sweet caresses, the way his arms trembled when he was inside her. Later, much later, she would attribute her invitation, her actions, to the henbane divination spell she had cast when they were alone in the circle together. She was sure she would have fallen into his arms eventually, but somehow, from some deep instinctual corner of her mind came a whisper of mortality, the realization that time is so very precious after all, and never more so for Alex and her than at that moment. After he left her, lying in a rapturous state of contentment, a feeling that maybe all the world's wrongs could be righted just for one day, 1 hour, one blissful moment of time when two people were so entwined with each other that we became a singular state of being and having, she drank the infusion of valerian, almost as if she had consumed a fairy tale sleeping potion. Her head fell back on the pillow, and the spell bottle slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor with a dull thunk. She slept, and she dreamed. Elizabeth Wither is in jail with Sarah Hutchins and Rebecca Cole, her coven. The walls are brick with one small window set high and crossbarred. Rebecca stands on the tips of her toes and forces her forearm through a gap that is barely wide enough to accommodate it. I hear children playing, she says wistfully. The door is iron-bound oak with a single opening, a narrow slot for the passage of meals. Sunlight dapples the cell, which smells equally of old urine and fear, a stale melange of odors. Sarah Hutchins sits on the fresh bundle of straw that has been forked into the corner. Sarah hugs herself and rocks slightly. So it has come to this, she says to no one in particular. We are to be hanged tomorrow. Rebecca looks to Wither, both hands now framing the child within her. Elizabeth, you believe they will truly hang us? All of us, Wither says, even you, Rebecca. But Wither's mind is awhirl with other plans. It is better that Wendell put an end to this chapter in its history, better that the coven disappear and be forgotten, and that is Wither's secret, even from the two closest to her. Wither has gloried in the feast of fear and terror, but this need not be the end to them. Wither has one bit of cunning left to offer them here, now, in their midnight hour. She has brought them to this place, where what she has to offer them will be their only escape. If she has chosen well, they will not resist an escape from the death and damnation that circumstances have brought them. They have been helpless victims empowered by her, and would be empowered one last time, one final way. To escape death, they must choose to surrender their humanity. Would you die tomorrow for their amusement? I spit on them, Rebecca says, even with my tongue swollen out of my mouth. And you, Sarah? Wither asks. Will that be your satisfaction? You have a plan, Elizabeth? I will let them hang me, Wither says mysteriously, walking over to an iron ring bolted to the wall and flipping it with her fingers. Rebecca looks in surprise at Wither, then Sarah, and back again. Wither meets her gaze. But that will not be the end for me. Speak it, Elizabeth, Rebecca urges. Sarah nods slowly. We are sisters, Wither says, but what I propose requires us to become true sisters of the blood, of my blood. Wither pushes back her sleeves and shows her forearms to them, where the veins are closest to the skin, the black veins. When Wither clenches her fists, the black veins throb. Her fingernails are as black as pitch now. I am more than what I seem, sisters. Even now you see the transformation within me. It will make me stronger and live longer beyond the day when even their memories are forgotten. But first I must sleep for long and long, safely tucked away. When I emerge, all that you see around you will long be forgotten to all but the scholars and their dusty books, yet even they will not know the whole truth of it. You will rise from death? Rebecca asks, awed. Not death, Wither says excitedly, but so it will appear to them, for my nature is as strange to them to be as unknown. I would need to sleep soon anyway, lest my different nature show too much upon me. Are you immortal, Elizabeth? Rebecca asks. There are cycles even to this life, but there is something to the immortal in it, though I am not immune to death. You say you sleep but do not sleep, die but do not die, yet there is nothing of this for Rebecca and myself, Sarah said. There is if you choose it, Wither says, taking Sarah's hands urgently in hers. I do not bear children, that is not my way, yet each kind must spread itself as it must. Rebecca says softly, We may become as you? If you choose quickly, there is time for the change to begin in you, Wither says. You will hang with me, but will not die, though all who fear you think it so. Once the change is upon you, hanging will be as nothing to you. A gentle tug on your altered flesh and sinew, an unpleasant tightness, but no snapping of the neck. Then a spelled sleep placed upon us? Sarah says, ever logical one, guessing the way of it. We will sleep and seem to die, and they will bury our bodies, alive and nothing but the cold earth for comfort. I would not live entombed in a much smaller prison than what these walls afford. Good, Sarah, you think ahead, but so, too, have I, Wither says. I have made certain arrangements with a gentleman in my employ. They will bury us quickly, that is their custom. Our sleep shall be short, as will be our entombment. Rebecca steps forward. I choose. Sarah nods, a fateful gesture. An easy choice when no other affords. Then we begin, so that my blood may acquaint itself with yours before our hour of reckoning. Wither pulls her sleeves back again and uses the hardened nail of her left index finger to slice open her skin in a line from the bend of her right elbow to her wrist. Then she repeats the procedure on her other arm. Sarah gasps. Rebecca speaks with awe. It is wonderful. Wither bleeds, but she bleeds unlike any human, her blood a swirling black that races with intent down her arms, across her palms, and out to her fingertips. Wither's eyes flutter up inside their sockets. Sarah realizes, even if Rebecca does not, that this is a natural process for Wither. She is not diminished by it. Rather, she is aroused. Wither offers a hand, palm up, to each of them. Drink it, she says breathlessly. First drink, to prepare yourselves for mingling my body with yours. Rebecca grabs Wither's right hand and brings it to her mouth, the look of the lover in her eyes as she places her lips to the black-coated fingers. She takes them in her mouth and closes her eyes. The streams of black blood appear to hurry on their course to her mouth. Rebecca moans pleasurably, even as droplets of black blood stain her lips and run down her chin. Her legs swoon, and Wither allows it, falling on her knees beside the red-haired woman. Sarah hesitates, staring at the fingers and seeing a final damnation and a final salvation in equal balance. Her eyes still closed, Wither says, Quick, Sarah, it is the only way. My blood will prepare the way for your blood. Drink before the mingling of blood. Now! Sarah nods, takes the offered hand in each of hers, delicately at first, mesmerized by the black droplets of blood pooled there, waiting for her. As her mouth hovers close, Wither surprises her by shoving her fingers forward. A drop of the strange black blood reaches her tongue, and her inner struggle is over. She falls to her knees, elated and trembling with exquisite exhaustion. Each of the fingers finds their way into her mouth, one after the other. The black blood races down her throat and fills her with an aching pleasure. She trembles on her knees, swaying back and forth, and, though she doesn't realize it, in perfect rhythm with Wither and Rebecca. Long moments pass, but Wither has not yet finished with them, though they lay besotted with her inhuman blood. She rouses them with gentle prodding until they kneel obediently before her again. Now we mingle your blood with mine, Wither says. Bare one of your forearms to me. They do as instructed, unquestioning. The pain will be less than you would have felt before tasting my blood. Wither's coarse fingernails poise over their arms, one index finger over each, near the bend of their elbows. She cuts them quickly in a parallel motion. Both women gasp. It stings, Rebecca says. Sarah grits her teeth. Wither bares her own forearms again. Whereas their red blood simply drips down to stain the straw, Wither's blood, which had already begun to settle and heal the self-inflicted wounds, becomes agitated again, as if sensing the presence of their blood so close. Black droplets chase around her arms, seeking. Wither holds her forearms under theirs. Clasp my arms as I clasp yours. We will become true sisters of the coven. Rebecca and Sarah nod. Wither's black blood almost seems to leap upward, defying gravity, straining to meet theirs. Wither grabs their arms with a fearsome grip, even as they grip hers. When skin and blood contact each other, Wither hisses a single word, her eyes blazing. Coven! As white-hot pain explodes within their bodies, scorching every nerve, Rebecca and Sarah scream. It is their last truly human act. The pain was a burst of fire within Wendy, recalling the fiery tendril that had leapt out of her burner and threatened to consume her. She screamed and convulsed, writhing off the bed to escape the agony. Her head struck the end table, gashing her forehead just above her right eye. She roused slowly, propped against the unforgiving metal handles of the drawers of her end table. Naked and trembling with a new chill that seemed to seep down deep into her bones, Wendy was unaware that her pentagram had fallen to the floor. She rolled into a fetal position, releasing from the dream, but still in a quasi-sleep state where reality and imagination overlapped and played tricks with her unconscious, fragmenting the details of the dream. Memory, flying over Wendell, spiraling down among the trees. She sees him perched on the roof of the trestle bridge. She scoops him up, her clawed fingers digging into his screaming flesh. Below, a pale girl face watches in horror, with mouth agape, and the memory ends. The rush of flight again, not memory, but now. She is flying again, swooping down over the field of circles where he is running in circles. Another boy, the one who interferes with her chosen. She swoops down to clutch this one, claws aching for the feel of flesh crushed beneath them. She wants to punish him, to tear him apart. He senses her, looks up, his face a pale blur of fright. He is Alex! Wendy's eyes snapped open, sleep instantly vanquished in a bright blossom of fear. She sat on the floor of her bedroom, shivering, arms wrapped around her bent knees, alone. It had been the worst dreams yet, and she prayed it was only a dream. She was lost without his heat beside her, maybe lost forever. By the time he'd returned to his dorm room, Alex was wide awake. After the freaky fire incident in the woods, when he thought Wendy had severely burned her arm, he thought his heart would never return to its resting rate. Later, he had calmed down, but Wendy had completely surprised him by taking him into her bed. Despite a layer of physical exhaustion and the memory of sheer pleasures, his mind was bouncing around, out of control, trying to sort out everything that had happened in a few short hours. No chance sleep would come any time soon, so he decided he might as well jog out all his kinks, give himself time to think in the familiar solitude of Marshall Field. In other words, a mental cool-down. He completed his stretching routine and curled his hands behind his neck, breathing deeply as he walked out onto the crumbling track. This was an old, familiar place. He wasn't nervous here, even at night. He began his first lap at a light pace, breathing easily through his nose, not pushing himself, yet. He also had to admit that while he found the ritual in the woods unusual in an extreme sense, it had also been incredibly sexy and fun, at least until it got really spooky. Alex finished the first lap, reset the chronometer on his watch to zeros, pressed the start button, and broke forward in a brisk run. Even though he could judge his pace accurately without it, the watch provided a backup when he was distracted. He quickened his pace after glancing at his watch, really wanting to work up a sweat tonight. His mind wandered to memories of intimacy with Wendy, leaving the immediacy of his physical exertion behind. He came around the last turn of the track to complete his third lap. As he neared the home team bleachers, he felt a cold draft of air wash up from behind him, a rotten breeze. He gagged, glancing back, and nearly screamed at what he saw. A clot of night and shadow was nearly on top of him. He stumbled, got quickly to his feet, and sprinted forward without looking back. "Never look back," his coach's voice yelling at him in trial runs. He ran with every ounce of strength, crossing the lanes of the track toward the grass. He had just run his best ever 100-meter dash time. A mantra, "Don't look back, don't look back." But the scared, primal animal inside him was in command tonight, not the coach. He glanced back. Nothing behind him. Where? It hit him between the shoulder blades, slamming him to the ground. Rolling with the blow, he avoided its claws as they scored the ground where he had been a moment before. Back on his feet, moving quickly before it could adjust its attack. Alex zigzagged across the grass, as if eluding a sniper's scope, then hurdled the cyclone fence. Definitely not one of his sports. His pants ripped as he came down awkwardly. He fell to his palms just as the flying thing struck the fence with a rattling clang that bowed the cyclone fence like one of those snag lines that catch landing jets aboard aircraft carriers. It shrieked at him, a strange, drawn-out, fear-inducing sound that made his skin crawl. Alex looked ahead at the home team bleachers, 20 feet away. He could make it if... Pain exploded on the side of his head as a clawed hand nearly ripped his right ear off. Staggering, stumbling, he threw himself through the gap between the third and fourth row benches. The brittle concrete foundation scraped the skin off his arm from wrist to elbow. When he stood up abruptly, he struck his head on an iron support, a bright spike of yellow sparks lancing through his brain. He listened for the flying thing, but heard only the ringing in his ears. Hunched over, he scampered deep under the bleachers until he had enough headroom to move about freely. He looked up at the horizontal slices of night sky visible between the wooden benches overhead. Long moments passed in silence. Alex thought that it, whatever it was, might have flown away, that maybe he was safe. He rose from his hunchback position. The seat above his head exploded, spraying chunks of decayed wood like shrapnel at his face. In the middle of the ruptured seat, a black-clawed hand shot down, grasping convulsively. And just beyond, a snarling visage filled with long yellow teeth. He dodged, but felt the claws catch his nylon warm-up jacket. He pulled away, trying to wriggle out of the jacket. The cloth tore, and overbalanced, he fell to the ground. The weight of the thing above him came down on the split bench with the force of a pile driver. Any moment the creature would come crashing through right on top of him. Under the bleachers, Alex rolled across the concrete, avoiding the scrabbling arms. He was deathly cold, watching the flying thing's clawed arms and feet clang against the iron struts, raking furrows through the broken concrete, missing him by inches and less. The sheer bulk of the thing kept its whole body from dropping down through the rusted iron framework of the bleachers, but that barrier couldn't be trusted to remain sturdy beneath that incredible weight and ferocity. His glimpse of the demonic face had brought with it a terrible recognition, a charcoal drawing on sketch paper, before Wendy had folded it up and tossed it into the flames. Wendy had somehow known this thing existed, but how? She had been trying to banish this boogeyman. Obviously that spell had failed. Suddenly the creature was gone, rising back into the starry sky, withdrawing long limbs from the ruptured bench. His scraped arm ached, and his torn ear throbbed with every rapid heartbeat. A sticky trail of blood ran down his neck. His only chance was to make a dash out from the bleachers, get into the building, somewhere, under a car, something, before the creature realized he had slipped free. But he needed a fair head start to make it anywhere close to a safe haven, if such a thing existed. Marshall Field, unfortunately, was isolated from the rest of the campus, so his only hope was some sort of diversion. His gaze never left the slices of dark sky between the benches. That's why he noticed when a constellation of stars winked out to his left. He dropped to a crouch as the bench over him shattered. Scampering sideways, crab fashion, he evaded the sweeping hand, flashing claws. Gone. He looked frantically to the left and right. Where the hell is it? The rusted iron framework above him had begun to creak under the stress. A fine grit of rust showered down on him, coating his sweats and stinging his eyes. Suddenly a large section of rotted timber struck his shoulder. He cried out in pain, falling even as the clawed hands burst through the debris once again. One thick arm scooped him up like a doll, slammed his body against the broken bench seat and iron supports, trying to pull him through the splintered gap. He blanked out for a second, then regained awareness as he slipped free from the grasp. He scrambled back, his breathing in agony. Several broken ribs, definitely, he thought, pressed in fear against an iron stanchion. His wrist was a mess, too, a bad sprain, already swelling. Was he still entertaining a mad dash across the Danfield campus with broken ribs? The palm of his good hand pressed the loose concrete around the stanchion. A saucer-sized piece shifted, scraped against the ground. He looked around, away from the ticket booth, and realized he had one chance to create a distraction. A large trash dumpster sat 15 yards beyond the bleachers. Darkness streaked across the star-flecked sky. He tossed the chunk of stone like a frisbee toward the hulking dumpster. The concrete wedge hit the side of the bin with a thundering racket, and in an instant the thing pounced with a terrifying ferocity. Alex scrambled to his feet, took a couple of steps, and knew it was useless. Behind him he heard the creature's ravenous destruction in the dumpster. A momentary silence fell, which frightened him even more. When he couldn't hear it, he didn't know where it was, what it was doing. He trotted gamely toward the ticket booth. After that he would be out in the open, and was at least a quarter mile to the nearest campus building. He thought he might even be able to make it, if he stopped gasping with every painful step. Why hadn't he borrowed Oz's car tonight of all nights? Then the inhuman roar of the creature and the thunderous weight of it pounding across the bleacher seats, clawed feet splitting timber, the iron framework first creaking, then groaning. All around Alex, reality distorted like a Dali-esque image, with the metal framework bending and twisting all around him. It felt like an earthquake, and the sky was falling all at the same time. A creaking explosion, as everything gave way, and the ticket booth was still too far away. He didn't even have time to look up as the tortured metal and rotted timbers came down to crush him like a giant's fist in one murderous instant, the last flash of pain so brilliant and quicksilver that it winked out in a merciful darkness. He never heard the sirens. Paul dreamt he was a child again, cowering inside the doghouse he'd built for the family's beloved lab. So lucid was the nightmare that closed overhead he could see the plywood roof and rusted shingling nails he'd hammered in a stray. Outside the doghouse, he knew, with a dream's dread certainty, something hungry was hunting him. Thud! Paul woke with a start, nearly tipping the folding chair in which he'd been dozing. He shook his head, still baffled with sleep. Karen lay sweat-sheened and feverish, the sheets kicked free and her nightgown raked up above her breasts. She gave a low moan and arched her back as if the bed itself was burning, as if she was offering up the naked swell of her pregnant belly on some dark altar. "Karen?" Paul asked, frightened, and heard her groan in reply. He saw a strange bruise at the base of her throat, a purpling of the skin, like a ligature mark. Thud! Something heavy landed on the pitched roof overhead, and in that strange heartbeat's silence before the attack began, Paul knew deep in his heart that his nightmare had found him in the waking world. "No!" Karen cried from her own fever dream as the scrabbling overhead turned destructive. It sounded to Paul in those first furious moments like a wrecking crew attacking the roof with crowbars. He heard the stuttering pop, 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 pop of roofing nails coming loose as whole sheets of shingles were torn free. Heard the explosive splintering of the first plywood being ripped from the frame. The whole house shook beneath the attack, and a fine rain of powdered drywall sifted down like fairy dust over the bed where Karen lay writhing. In that instant Paul understood that the thing on the roof wanted Karen for itself, and would not be denied. No time to think, no time to plan a defense. Paul ran to the bedroom window and threw open the screen sash. Ignoring the 3-story drop, he swung his upper body outside and turned so he was sitting on the sill. He gripped the edge of the roof, the shingles gritty beneath his fingertips. He contorted himself until he managed to get his work boots on the windowsill, and then stood, hauling himself up onto the roof. The full moon had brightened in its ascent until it became bone-white and radiant, like a bleached skull. It cast a brilliant cold light over the rooftop landscape of chimneys and satellite dishes, and illuminated the dark goblin at work on Karen's rooftop. It was enormous, a hunched black thing, its spine a tortured ridge in the moonlight, its crooked arms draped in tatters like Spanish moss. The monster's back was to Paul as it focused entirely on its task of destruction. It tore another long sheet of shingles free and tossed it aside, raised a claw like a cage of branches and punched through the plywood, shrieking as it worked. Paul cast about for a weapon, fixed on the crumbling chimney a few yards away. The mortar was rotten, the bricks leaning precariously. Project number 4 on his priority list of repairs before winter. He tugged 2 bricks free of the crumbling stack and had the fleeting thought, "Don't be an idiot, you can't fight it up here. This is its domain." He pushed the fear away and embraced the cold fury that shot through him like a current of mercury. He hurled the first brick. It struck the goblin between its broad shoulders, and when the monster turned in outrage, the second brick hit it full in the face. It shrieked in agony as the sun-rotten bricks shattered, driving fragments of splintered brick into its eye. Paul staggered back a step on the pitched roof as the goblin swelled in rage, its hunched back broadening around it like a cape. It fixed him with a look of pure hate, and though he'd never before seen a face so horrible, he recognized it nonetheless as human. Then it came at him. At 2 a.m., long after visiting hours had concluded for the night, Abby's father came staggering onto the pediatric intensive care unit. He'd been out drinking at the tap room all evening and reeked now of cigarettes and cheap beer. He was a self-pitying drunk, a barroom job, and tonight, as his drinking mates stood him one sympathy round after another, he'd become increasingly maudlin, lamenting his shitty life, and even shittier ex-wife, and most of all the shitty twist of fate that had landed his little girl in the hospital. His circuitous homeward journey behind the wheel of his Camaro took him through Wendell's rolling hinterlands, and when he looked up suddenly and found himself outside Wendell General, he decided then and there that he had every right, as a parent, as a victim, to visit Abby. He'd slipped easily past the groggy security guard in the lobby and rode the elevator up to the quiet PICU. For once, luck was on his side, and the night RNs on duty were occupied elsewhere as he passed their abandoned station. He entered Abby's little alcove and sat by her bedside, listening to the quiet beep, beep, beep of her heart monitor. She was resting curled up on her side, sucking the 2 long fingers of her right hand while her left played absently with her blonde hair. He didn't understand why she still wore the metal halo, didn't understand why they'd said at first she'd never walk again, but had now changed their minds. Doctors. He knew only that he disliked them, especially that smartass with the fucked-up foreign name who looked at him as if he had no fair claim to fatherhood. Abby wasn't sleeping, but neither did she seem entirely awake, and lay staring past him at the wall. "Hey, baby," he said quietly. Nothing. She still wasn't talking, and he felt no urgency to encourage her. He felt nervous with her here, among strangers. Vulnerable. Both of them. He reached out to touch one of her bare legs where she'd kicked free of the blankets. He could feel his daughter's pulse at the knee, tiny and lost. Her eyes flicked to him then, as if noticing for the first time he was there. "Hey, sugar," he said, giving her a smile that he hoped bound them, father and daughter, in secret covenant. He leaned across the space separating them to give her a kiss on the brow, and noticed the deep discoloration at her throat, as if she'd been caught in a garrote. At the same time, he caught a whiff of something unpleasant exuding from her skin. Her hand shot out and clamped around his Adam's apple. Her nostrils flared as he thought he saw her smiling as he dropped to his knees at the bedside, trying to free himself from her crushing grip on his throat. The little girl sat up, eyes rolled back in her head. With her free hand, she wrenched the halo free, tugging until the cranial screws came loose. Then rivulets of blood trickled down from her hairline. She swung her legs out of bed. She released her father, and he pitched forward, choking and retching on the floor. From his vantage, he saw his daughter's bare feet on the tiles, and looking up, he saw her move as if in a trance away from the bed. She didn't seem to notice the IVs she was trailing until the tubes grew taut. Then she turned and with a single savage jerk yanked the needles free of her veins. He lay curled up now, holding his bruised throat, looking up at his daughter. She froze suddenly where she stood, alert like a doe to some unseen danger. She cocked her head and listened, tracking the sound across the ceiling tiles. She made a weird warbling sound, a coo, and then she urinated, the stream soaking her hospital gown and pooling at her bare feet. He cowered beneath the hospital bed and watched as the little girl who had been his daughter followed the sound she alone heard out of the room. In the dream that wasn't a dream, Abby was walking again, the tiles chilly beneath her feet as she moved through the silent PICU corridors. She felt drawn forward by an invisible tether, like the irresistible sound of music playing in a distant room. Her eyes were closed now, and she no longer needed them to follow the call that drew her through night-silent corridors. Her feet turned to a whisper as tiles became carpet. She trailed the long fingers of her right hand, her becoming fingers, along the wall like a blind girl, and with the confidence of the blind, knew her touch would not betray her, but would lead her safely through this unlit terrain. Here. She opened her eyes and found herself in another short corridor before a set of pine doors. Doors opened for her, and she seemed to glide forward weightlessly. The chapel was empty, its darkness heavy with the smell of extinguished candles. The doors shushed closed behind her, sighing on their tired hinges. As she floated deeper into the waiting darkness, she dropped her hands, fingertips gliding over the smooth ranks of pews to either side. Above the simple altar rose the chapel's sole adornment, a great abstract mosaic of stained glass through which the full moon shone. Abby hung suspended before the altar, dappled in the kaleidoscope of filtered moonlight. She could hear the call of the moon beyond the glass, a single, deeply resonant note, like the sound of a mountain might make. So intently was she focused on the moon's song that she didn't hear the chapel doors fly open behind her, didn't hear her father calling her name, or the sudden explosion of stained glass as the angel came to take her. Some mid-chapter coffee.